when I went through Leadership Lafayette, I was one of 2 African Americans in a class of 30. And they have a day called Foundation Day. And during Foundation Day, speakers come in and talk about how Lafayette was founded and how many different groups of people came in to form what we know today as Lafayette. And for me, there was no conversation about African Americans. I felt like my story wasn't being told. And I wanted my story to be told, not just for me, but I thought it was important for the collective to understand how we all help form this community in which we all live in. So I actually had a coffee meeting with my friend in Swanson, and I was explaining to her how I wanted my story to be told, and she was like, wow, it just so happens that my husband is a civil rights professor. So that just worked out really well. So from there, that conversation actually happened in January of 2016, and a year later, we actually had the first presentation given to Leadership Lafayette Class 30 in March of 2017. So this has been a journey for me. I'm so excited that all of you are here to share this experience and to really start to learn collectively as a community what it means to know your history and how that can impact us and affect us all moving forward. So I have the distinct privilege of introducing Dr. Rick Swanson. I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. It's going to be like 3 sentences. Rick Swanson earned his JD from Southern Illinois University in 1994 and then went on to earn a PhD from the University of Kentucky. In 2001, he joined the Department of Political Science at UL Lafayette to be their pre-law teacher and advisor. He is currently the department chair. He has written a book chapters, journal articles, and encyclopedia entries involving law and politics, including civil rights history. So without further ado, Dr. Rick Swanson.
So thank you, Sarah, for that introduction, and thank you for Conversation Starters for inviting me. Ordinarily, I would talk like this. The podium's up here, and I have to use the computer, so I'm going to look like a preacher on a pulpit. So you'll excuse me. I feel like I have more authority up here now. But I want to talk, first of all, why history? One of my favorite quotes is, by the way, can everyone hear me okay in the back? All right. Those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. We don't just study history for its own sake. We want to learn from it so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And it's like if you woke up with amnesia, you wouldn't know who you are, what you're doing, where you're going. You start to invent false narratives, false stories about yourself. Well, we do the same with history. If we don't know what our history is, we start to make up stories, and those are often false. And that leads us then to false understandings about current issues, and then we come up with false solutions, or very impartial solutions. So we really want to understand history to improve our lives and improve our community. Now I'm going to warn you, this content is pretty disturbing. Just like we couldn't talk about the Nazi Holocaust without talking about a lot of really disturbing facts. There's a lot of disturbing facts here. There's a lot of really violent and oppressive history. So I'm going to warn you, you're going to hear a lot of things that are going to disturb you. You're going to see a lot of what is now considered obsolete or offensive language quoted from a lot of people that said a lot of things back then or how it was discussed. And this is uncomfortable. Discussing race is, I think, some people call it the third rail of politics. It's even more uncomfortable than religion or politics. And so, yes, it's uncomfortable, but we've got to do it, and it's important. And this information will cause various emotions in you, regardless of who you are, maybe different emotions from each other, but it is going to cause some emotions in you. And I'm going to just say I've spent a lot of time, almost every waking moment when I wasn't doing my job, doing this kind of research, a lot of primary archives and secondary sources. By the way, I'm going to skip through some of these slides. I have so many slides and there's so much data, I can't really cover each one in depth in this time I have tonight. In fact, some of these slides are worthy of a whole hour presentation in themselves. But very luckily, Ed Bowie from AOC, Acadiana Open Channel, has been very gracious to tape this tonight. He's going to put it on AOC and going to splice in the slides into the presentation. So if I skip over some of the information, you say, wait a second, I wanted to see that slide. You'll get another chance. But I'm going to be skipping just for time constraints. And I do have a lot of acknowledgments. Obviously, I don't have the time to go over them all, but a lot of people have helped me by directing me to these possible sources of information. And really, this is sort of a lost history in the sense that it's not really told. I've studied a lot of national civil rights and civil rights of the South, and even some of Louisiana. And when Skyler asked me to talk about civil rights history of Lafayette Parish. There was almost nothing, just a little bit, and I had to do a lot of digging, only a few secondary sources, but a lot of primary archives. And here you see just a couple examples of the kinds of things I've had to read through. And here's one example, a photo I took of the original 1823 Lafayette Parish slave code, which I will come back to. So we always are going to start at the beginning. Historic homelands. Slaves in the Americas were from the west coast of Africa. And because Louisiana, this was Louisiana, a French colony, most of the enslaved people here were brought from the French colonies in Africa, which was known at the time as Senegambia. Today that comprises, or is comprised of the countries of Senegal, Gambia, and Mali. And Louisiana had a very detailed code to deal with enslaved people and even free blacks, and it was called Le Code Noir, the Black Code. And here's just a very few out of a very lot of provisions. But notice it establishes that all kinds of very strict controls for slaves. And just to show you how brutal this already was, at the end of it they say runaway slaves, at the first instance of trying to escape your enslavement, your ears are cut off and you're branded. The second instance, you are what's called hamstrung. Basically what that means is your hamstring muscles here in your legs, they are severed and it permanently cripples you. And then on the third offense, you're executed. So already this suppression of people trying to resist enslavement was very brutal. When this area became part of the United States, it was called Attakapaw County, and Lafayette Parish, in the darker red there, was formed out of the larger Attakapaw County. And slavery was already a huge part of this region. Here you see in 1774, it was already almost a third of the population in the Attakapaw County was enslaved. Down here by 1803, as it becomes part of the U.S., it's just over a third of the population is enslaved. Here now, when you see 1820, just before Lafayette Parish is formed, it's almost half of the population of this region is enslaved. And Jean Mouton, who is generally considered the founder of Vermilionville, he owned slaves himself. So slavery was already deeply ingrained in the founding of Lafayette Parish. This is because of the fertile land along the rivers in Lafayette Parish. The Bayou Vermilion and the Bayou Tortue. There's not a lot of settlement along the Bayou Tortue today, but there was back then. And as rivers overflowed, the land is very fertile. And the primary crops here were what are called cash crops. People didn't grow them for food, but they grew them for economic gain. And it was primarily sugarcane and cotton, and then later rice by the 1850s. These are all very labor intensive. And the whites who owned this land and who grew these crops decided that they would go with the cheapest form of labor, which is free labor, by forcing people to work against their will, by enslaving. So already, because we were 90% rural agricultural economy, and these cash crops were the primary economy of the region, and this was all based on a slave-based agriculture, slave-based agriculture was the economic foundation of Lafayette Parish. This is a huge business. Here you see, these are, by the way, are examples of ads out of the Opelousas Courier. The Lafayette Advertiser, which is the precursor to the Daily Advertiser, we only have surviving records going back to 1869. So prior to that, we learned about Lafayette Parish from surrounding newspapers that are still existing from surrounding parishes. And here you see the Opelousas Courier, which I'll come back to more throughout the presentation. You see slaves are being sold, they're being hired out, rented. And here you see a discussion saying, this is, the Opelousas Courier explained it, the value of slaves is by far the largest portion of any investment for agricultural purposes. And since agriculture was the primary basis of the economy, this meant that ownership of human beings was the largest single source of wealth in this area at the time. And here you see, once Louisiana became a state, it basically modified the Louisiana, or the former French Code Noir, and formed the Black Code. Slaves have to have written permission to leave a plantation. And again, this is just very short excerpts from the whole lengthy code. Even free blacks were forbidden from moving into the territory. Only white men could vote. And so the key point here is that right there in the first Louisiana Constitution, the notion was firmly established that there's something inherently superior about light-skinned people and something inferior about dark-skinned people, such that they do not deserve equal civil rights. But people didn't resist their enslavement. In fact, the largest slave revolt in U.S. history happened in Louisiana in 1811 between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Several hundred slaves tried to escape freedom, to freedom, they were defeated by armed white militias who then executed and decapitated several dozen of them. And as a symbol to other enslaved people not to resist their enslavement, they took their heads and put them on spikes and put those spikes along the Mississippi River and along the plantations along the Mississippi River. And the Whitney Plantation, which is in that area now, it's the first dedicated museum in the country specifically to slavery, to telling the stories of enslaved people. They, I think, have completed it by now. I was there a few weeks ago, and they were in the process of building a memorial to commemorate the victims of that. And here you see, this is under construction right now. There's many more representations of severed heads that they are going to be showing there. And my understanding is, I talked to a couple that was there a couple weeks ago, and they said they put it all behind some bushes, so if you have children, you can be told, okay, if you want to see this, you can go behind these bushes, just be warned. But it's showing how brutal the suppression was. But what's interesting, even though this set a climate of terror all throughout Louisiana, still slavery was so horrible that people still tried to resist enslavement, including in Lafayette Parish. There was a major attempt at a slave revolt in Lafayette Parish in 1840 with a couple dozen enslaved people, but unfortunately for them, one of their fellow slaves told on them before they were able to implement the escape plan. They were captured, and according to newspaper accounts at the time, all but 3 were executed. Again, to send this message, you better not attempt to resist enslavement. And we know what slavery is like because we actually have the narratives of enslaved people, including people who were enslaved here in Lafayette Parish. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the federal government hired writers and set them out across the South to contact people who had still been, who were now in the 1930s, they were very old, but they had been enslaved as children or teenagers back in the 1860s prior to emancipation. And they asked them to talk about what it was like when they were enslaved. Here you see one example of Agatha Babineau, who was enslaved near Carencro, and she talks about how they had dirt floors, the masters had children by the slaves, and really, if you think about it, if you're enslaved, you really can't say no, and this is rape. And so the masters would rape these women, and then most, as she said, a lot of their own children they would keep enslaved or even sell off to other owners. So they would have to keep their own children enslaved. She said she was beaten badly. He would even rub salt and pepper in the wound. And she was allowed sometimes to travel, but they had to have a written pass. And if she didn't have a written pass, she would get beaten. And so we do have these first-hand accounts of slavery. And remember I said some of these slides would be worthy of a whole hour themselves. If you look up online, they're actually free digital online. Just look up the Federal Writers Project, Slave Narratives, thousands of pages of narratives. You can read all about the personal experiences of what slavery was like. And it was brutal. And here you just see a few examples from the Appalachia Courier of all of the business that was going on, just trying to prevent people from escaping. In fact, here in Lafayette Parish, we were formed in 1823, and right away, Lafayette Parish, the governing board of the parish, called the police jury, created an extensive system of slave patrols. They divided the parish into wards with a patrol captain. Each ward had essentially a ward captain. All adult white men had to take part in this, kind of like jury service. It was expected. And they would travel around on horseback, armed. They were actually given a list of all the slaves at each of the plantations, and they would go and check to make sure there was no one there who wasn't supposed to be there, and that everyone who was supposed to be there was there. And if anyone was there who wasn't supposed to be there, they would get beaten. And if anyone wasn't there who was supposed to be there, they would hunt you down and beat you. And if you resisted, they had authority to use violent and deadly force if needed. And in fact, in the South, these slave patrols were really the first police forces. What's interesting, in fact, here you see probably the most famous photo of a victim of slavery. Probably some of you have seen this photo before. His name was Gordon, sometimes also called Peter. He actually was right here from from St. Landry Parish, just north of us. Here he is right after he escaped to Union forces in Baton Rouge. He ran 40 miles through the woods. Here he is. The photo was taken, and then he took off his shirt to show what kind of victimization he had. And in fact, if you were caught escaping, you would get 25 lashes. Now, I don't know how many lashes that was, but if somebody knows what they're doing with a whip, that's what 25 lashes could do. And in fact, I'm still trying to locate the source of this, but I've read one narrative where he says he was in bed for 2 months recovering. And of course, you could die from this, from either blood loss or from infection. And in fact, throughout the early 1800s, Lafayette Parish continued to make its slave patrols stricter and stricter with more enforcement, tougher punishments. Finally, by 1860, and this was after the 1859 John Brown's raid, that even though it failed, it sort of sent a paranoia throughout the South, the Southern whites, that slaves are going to be trying to escape with the aid of whites. And so there was a major increase in 1860, led by a Lafayette Parish police jury member, Alfred Mouton, who then actually by the end of 1860 became its parish, the parish president. And so basically he was in charge of overseeing this systematic torture and sometimes murder of enslaved people if they attempted to escape or resist. And really, other than roads or bridges, when you flip through the Lafayette Parish police jury records from that time period, other than building and maintaining roads and bridges, the other main function they did was the slave patrols. So let's look at the census. Here's Louisiana. All the way up until the Civil War, almost half, in 1830, slightly over half of the population of the state was enslaved. And the number circled on the lower right is 29% of all white households in Louisiana had one or more slaves. What about Lafayette Parish? Here's the census data for Lafayette Parish. By 1860, 49.6, almost half the population of this parish was enslaved. And the most remarkable number on the lower right there, 46.8% of all white households in Lafayette Parish owned one or more slaves. In fact, of those slave-owning households, it was an average of 8.6 slaves. And so sometimes you hear that only about 3 or 6% of Southerners owned slaves. That is a false statistic. Because what that's doing is that's taking the entire population of the Deep South and the border states and simply dividing by the number of slaves and saying, well, it only looks like it was maybe 6 out of 100 people owned slaves. But if you look at the Deep South, it's much higher. If you eliminate the black population, which is half, now it goes way up. And the way the census looked at it only attributed ownership to the head of the household. It didn't attribute it to the household. But when you look at the census records, and typically the head of household was a man, but then you'd have the wife, many children, because there were big households back then. And when you can actually look at the 1850 and 1860 census records, and I've done so for Lafayette Parish, and other scholars have as well, almost half of all white households in Lafayette Parish had one or more slaves. They're getting an average of 8.6 slaves. Why was it higher in Louisiana or in Lafayette Parish than Louisiana as a whole? Because of the river parishes here. You see the Red River, Mississippi, Bayou Vermilion, Bayou Teche. This is where slavery was most concentrated because of the fertile river land. Here you see, again, this is from the 1860 census records. 68% of slave owners in Lafayette Parish were Acadian. And here you see the largest slave-owning names, largest slave-owning families. And then I recorded, and that's not a complete list. There's a few I couldn't read in the original census records. I'm still doing some research. I think some other people have definitively come up with that list. But those are the ones that I could read clearly, and I'm still not sure about the spelling, because again, the original documents are really hard to read. But notice the vast majority are Acadian, and the point is that we always hear this story about the Acadians were an oppressed people, and they have this story of overcoming, and they were oppressed and they did overcome. But within a few short generations, they went from the oppressed to the oppressors. Now let's put this in a big picture. If you look at the states ranked by percent of the population enslaved, South Carolina was tops with 57%. Louisiana was third with 47%. If Lafayette Parish were a state, it would be ranked third at almost half. What about percent of free households owning slaves? Louisiana was actually 29%. Lafayette Parish, 46.8. It would be ranked second if it were a state. So here's the key point. In Lafayette Parish, slavery was more deeply ingrained and enmeshed in the economic and political culture than it was than the rest of Louisiana on average, or even the rest of the Deep South on average. Which is not surprising why, then, that Lafayette Parish voted overwhelmingly for the strongest pro-slavery candidate in the 1860 presidential election. Lincoln didn't get one vote because he wasn't allowed on the ballot. And in the Lafayette Parish secession vote, then, Lafayette Parish whites voted by a 10-to-1 ratio for secession. And they were led by Alexander Mouton, former governor, a rabid secessionist, And he actually ended up chairing the Louisiana Secession Convention. So Lafayette Parish was actually at the forefront of Louisiana secession. Now, one of the handouts I gave you was basically the causes of the Civil War. I'm not going to go over that handout, but sometimes people still today debate, well, was the Civil War caused by slavery? Well, if you ask the Southern whites at the time, 1860 and 1861, when they were seceding, when they were forming the Confederacy, when they began fighting, they themselves said that the reason they were leaving the U.S. and forming the Confederacy was to keep 4 million human beings enslaved because they were an inferior race. And this is what they themselves said. They all said this. The president, vice president of the Confederacy, the Attorney General of the Confederacy, the Southern governors, the state legislatures, the secession conventions, when they issued their declarations of secession. It was only after the Civil War that they began to rewrite history and claim that the Civil War was not about slavery. But if you look at all their statements at the time, they said it was simply to keep human beings enslaved. And here's a local example where the Appaloosa's Courier says the slavery question is the only one that has ever threatened the permanency of the American Union. And even in 1864, still, the Appaloosa's Courier is saying the encroachments of abolitionism, the attempt to abolish slavery, caused the war. So again, they're still saying this as the war is ongoing. It was only after the war the Southern whites attempted to rewrite history and say it was not about the war. So that one handout that I gave you just lists a whole lot of the major quotes by major Southern white leaders at the time about how it was about slavery. So then now the Civil War comes and Louisiana joins the Confederate States of America. The Union captures New Orleans and Baton Rouge, so Opelousas actually became the Confederate capital. Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and then Union General Banks comes through this part of the country as part of, or on the way towards what's called the Red River Campaign, fighting up near Alexander. And you see he goes through Morgan City, then called Brashear, comes right through Vermilionville. Now this is really important. When he came through Vermilionville, this had a huge effect on the local enslaved people. The records show that a lot of the plantation owners took their slaves and fled in advance because they knew their slaves were going to be liberated. So they took them either to far north Louisiana or to West Texas, or I'm sorry, just over west towards Texas. Some actually hid from Union troops, and in some of their narratives they said, that we talked about earlier, they said they were told by their owners that the Yankees were coming to kill them all, and they didn't know any better. But thousands understood that this meant freedom, and they escaped to the Union forces, to the Union lines, and were liberated. And then they became either workers for the Union Army or workers on plantations, agricultural workers, paid now. A lot of them became soldiers, and a lot, if you were elderly, children, sick, then you became war refugees. And Union General Banks even issued a proclamation where he said, whether you're free or slave, if you can make your way to the Union flag, then you've made your way to liberty. And this particular day when the Confederate forces were defeated, literally where the Pinhook Bridge is right now in Lafayette, this is called the Battle of Vermilion Bayou, sometimes called the Battle of Pinhook Bridge. This Union presence, this Union victory, so affected so many enslaved people in Lafayette Parish, it's really one of the most important civil rights events in Lafayette Parish history. Really, I think it should be a day of celebration and remembrance annually. And here's an illustration from Harper's Weekly, which was the leading northern magazine at the time that covered the Civil War. An illustration showing people escaping slavery, making their way to the Union forces and to freedom. And we know that the Union Army supported black war refugees because we have it in the reports, where here you have General Banks saying that we're having to support the poor and infirm, people who they can't take care of themselves, they need food, they need clothing, they need shelter, they need medical care. And how are we paying for this? Well, we're taking the crops as we're going through the plantations, we're seizing the crops, selling them, and that's funding the war effort to end slavery. And that's also then providing for these war refugees. And he says, these expenses have been paid out of rents and contributions levied upon rebel property. So here's one of the key points. You often hear about the Yankees just coming through and plundering and marauding. And sure, in any war, you're going to have some people just stealing for their own benefit, and some people going out of control and just wantonly damaging things. But the Confederate forces did a whole lot of plundering of agricultural products and the plantations as well to feed themselves and fund the war effort. As they were, in fact, in some cases in this area, they would be burning all of the plantation crops in advance so that the Union forces couldn't get them. So it was actually destroyed by Confederate forces. But the key point is that most of the confiscated Confederate property was to fund the war effort and to provide for the refugees that had been now freed from slavery. Now, as I talked about, some of these now free blacks joined Union forces, and they were known as the U.S. colored troops. Over 24,000 Louisiana blacks joined Union forces. And here you see that slave you saw the image of earlier, who had the severely whipped scars on his back from whipping. There is an illustration from Harper's Weekly. He actually did join Union troops and fought in the siege of Port Hudson, the Baton Rouge. One of the most interesting things I discovered in my research was that there were U.S. colored troops from Lafayette Parish. The Freedmen's Bureau, which I'll talk about shortly, which was formed after the Civil War, paid out discharge bonuses to any former Union soldiers. And here you have, this is actually in the Vermilionville field office. Vermilionville was the name of the town before Lafayette was named Lafayette. And here you see a list of all the discharge bonuses paid. And I looked them up in the National Park Service Soldier and Civil War Soldier and Sailors database. And all the ones with asterisks I was able to confirm. And most interesting, there was a black soldier from Lafayette Parish named Alfred Mouton. So the Union defeated the Confederacy. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but the Southern whites were still left in political power temporarily, and they attempted to reinstate something just short of slavery, and these were called Black Codes. Again, we don't have the surviving Black Code of Lafayette Parish, but St. Landry Parish, here we have the one from them, just our neighboring parish, and basically they took the slave patrol codes and just substituted the word Negro for slave and the word employer for slave owner, and put all the same restrictions on travel and gathering on now free blacks as had been applied to slaves. And prior to the Civil War, there had been sort of a three-tier system of free whites, free blacks that had much lesser rights than whites. They were a small percent of the population, and then enslaved blacks. Well, what these black codes did, and after the Civil War, it eliminated the three-tier system and just created the two-tier system, because now even the formerly free blacks were subject to even more restrictions than they had been subjected to during slavery. Now they were subject to, again, all this rewritten slave code. And here's just a little example of white supremacy in Lafayette Parish. By the way, one important thing to understand, you have to forget what you understand about the modern political parties or the names of the modern political parties. At the time, Lincoln was a Republican. The Republican Party was in favor of emancipation and freedom, in favor of black voting rights and black civil rights. It was the Democratic Party that was the white supremacist party of the South that was against all this. And here you see the Louisiana Democratic Party platform saying that we should be a government of white people perpetuated to the exclusive benefit of the white race. They say that people of African descent cannot be even considered as citizens, and there can be in no event, under any circumstances, any equality between the white and other races. And the Democratic Party won the election in Lafayette Parish. So this shows you a majority of white voters, white male voters at the time, adopted this view of white supremacy by endorsing that Democratic platform, by voting for it. But then we move into a period of history known as Reconstruction. Because the South had been destroyed, not just physically, but the social institutions of the South had been destroyed. Instead of this racial class system, it needed to be rebuilt or reconstructed on a system of racial equality. And so Congress and then began this, and then when President Grant was elected, he continued this. The 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution were passed. It said, basically, provided for the Equal Protection Clause, says the right to vote shall not be denied on account of race. And the Freedmen's Bureau was created to help the now free blacks and provide food, clothing, shelter, education, medical care, to negotiate wages for work, and all sorts of things. And initially then you have, now with these new constitutional amendments are being enforced by Union troops in the South. Here you see, again, St. Landry Parish voter registration. Huge numbers of blacks are registering to vote exercising this new freedom that has been granted them. Now we begin to start to have some evidence of what happened in Lafayette Parish. So 1867, you have every few days a report by the commissioner of the Vermilionville field office. And he says in 1867, you have 600 freedmen, and some whites are actually forming themselves into a political organization, the Republican Club. Yet already there are armed gangs, 200 to 300 men, white men, trying to catch the leaders of the Republican Club and threatening to kill anyone who goes to these meetings. Nonetheless, in the face of these threats, an election took place, and it says here the colored candidate Fortuny Riard won. And I'm going to come back to him in a second. Here you see then, that election was actually for delegates to rewrite the Louisiana Constitution. And in 1868 it was rewritten providing racial equality. All persons shall be treated equally, voting rights for everyone. It even said that businesses couldn't deny you service regardless of race. It said that schools could not be segregated, they had to be integrated. So the 1860 Louisiana Constitution was extremely progressive for its time. And you had all kinds of black elected officials in Louisiana during Reconstruction as these civil rights were enforced. Lots of local officials, House and Senate, Louisiana Senate and House members, governors, 1 governor, 2 lieutenant governors, 3 U.S. House of Representatives, and 1 U.S. senator who, when he got there, the rest of the Senate refused to see him because of his color. And this illustration here is just some of the black representatives to the 1867 Louisiana Constitutional Convention. And that member who had actually been elected from Louisiana, unfortunately his photo isn't here, but I was able to find out a lot about him. Alexander Fortuny Riard, and he went by Fortuny. He was first elected as the Lafayette Parish delegate to the Louisiana Constitutional Convention, was very active and a leader in the state Republican Party for the next decade. Actually was elected to the Louisiana Senate from this district, but within a few weeks, the Louisiana Senate denied him a seat again because he was colored, as they said. But what's really fascinating is that I'd never heard about this leading political figure of this parish at the time. What happened then, the Southern whites violently resisted equality for blacks. They formed white supremacist terrorist organizations. The KKK wasn't very active locally because they were anti-Catholic. With a predominantly Catholic population, alternative white terrorist groups had to rise up that embraced Catholicism. First, the Knights of the White Camellia, and then the White League was founded in 1874. And both of these wreaked havoc locally. Here you see Freedmen's Bureau reports from 1865 to 1867. Now this is all across Louisiana, not just Lafayette Parish. But you see 70 people killed, 70 freedmen killed by whites. And here's what's critical. In no instance has a white man been punished for killing or ill-treating a freedman. Local white judges and juries would not convict any white person of murder or any kind of violence against a black person if the white person was trying to prevent political activism and equality. Here you see an example of white on black violence just in Lafayette Parish, and this is just for the report of November 1868. Shot, life-threatened, killed, mortally wounded. And again, not one white person was punished. So murder of blacks by whites in Lafayette Parish went completely unpunished during this time. And it wasn't just individual crimes either. It was massacres all across Louisiana. And these are just some of the major massacres of Louisiana during Reconstruction. The white on black massacres. The nearest one to us was Opelousas, 29. And these figures, the historical figures, we don't know for certain. So the number on the left of deaths is the minimum number historians have been able to confirm. The higher number is where some historians suspect, but we can't really confirm because, bodies, literally, the bodies were often just dumped in rivers, and the white officials who were reporting the number of deaths were often vastly underestimated the number of people killed, so we don't know for sure. But again, look at the circle there. 0 whites were ever convicted of any of these massacres. Even in the case of the Colfax massacre, local white prosecutors and judges would not convict, and juries. So when federal forces tried to implement federal charges, in the case of the Colfax massacre, those charges went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court said that Congress lacked the authority to make these federal crimes, which meant that after the Colfax massacre, if you were a Southern white, you knew that you were immune from prosecution under either state or federal law for any kind of violence, including murder, including massacre of anyone who was black. That's how bad it was. And here you see a map of those. And notice Lafayette is right in the middle of all this, and how I'll show you how bad it got in Lafayette in a moment. So here's the 1868 Democratic candidate, Ulysses Grant, in favor of voting rights for blacks. The 1868 Democratic candidate, an overt white supremacist, that's one of his campaign slogans there. It's a white man's country, let white men rule. Now, what the Democrats did was they labeled the Republicans as radical Republicans. And you might have heard this term historically, the radical Republicans during this time. There was only one reason that the Democrats labeled them as radical, because what they said was the radical idea was that blacks should be able to vote, have equal rights, and get elected to office. And that was radical. And here you see from the Opelousas Courier again, all in favor of Negro suffrage, meaning the right of blacks to vote, are of the radical party. All against Negro suffrage, against black voting, we term Democrats. So whenever you hear this term, the radical Republicans, that's the only thing that made them radicals, is they wanted equality. They favored equality. So here you have reports from the Vermilionville Freedmen's Bureau office, Lafayette Parish, 1868. There wasn't a single large-scale massacre as occurred in some of the other nearby parishes, but there was systematic murder of blacks, especially black Republican leaders. The killers were typically armed and disguised gangs of whites, usually happening at night. Often there were eyewitnesses, but the eyewitnesses would simply say, oh, I have these alibis, and local white judges and juries would not convict. They would dismiss these charges. Here's how bad it got in Lafayette Parish. Again, these are the reports of the agent here in Vermilionville. May 10th, 1868. Hundreds of freedmen have not even slept in their homes. They're sleeping out in the open air in groups of 20 to 30, guarding watch for fear of being massacred. The whites are parading openly in arms. And then now you're approaching the 1868 presidential election. He says that pretty much anyone who's black who's been prominent in politics has been run away. And those who have remained have obtained protection papers for the Democratic Party, saying they've forever renounced the Republican Party and joined the Democrats. And often they renounce the right to even register to vote or ever meddle in politics. And I found confirmation of this in the Opelousas Courier. The Opelousas Courier actually printed the form to form these Democratic clubs, and they called it the Hancock Club. John Hancock meaning his signature. So what these armed white groups would do is say, hey, we want you to sign to promise you're going to vote Democratic or we will kill you. And so you will join our club. They called it the Hancock Colored Club. And so here's actually the form, and if you go against that, we will have a committee investigate you and withdraw our support from you. Basically meaning we will hunt you down and kill you. And here you see in the Opelousas Courier a letter that must have been obviously written by someone, because the signatures of all these blacks have an X there, indicating that they really didn't sign their name, they just signed with an X, and somebody else typed up their names in this letter where they say, we renounce all right to register or vote, and they agree to have nothing whatever to do with any party or to meddle with politics in any way. So corroborating evidence that that was going on here in Lafayette Parish, as the Vermilionville Field Office agent said. And in fact, there were assassinations in Lafayette Parish leading up to the 1868 presidential election of leading black Republicans. And we also have further corroborating evidence. Remember Agatha Babineau, the slave, a former slave I mentioned earlier? She says that when freedom came, and she called them the Ku Klux, even though they weren't technically the Ku Klux, but I think she was just labeling all these violent white supremacist organizations as Ku Klux. She says, they came and said, if you don't vote Democrat, they will kill you, and they killed her uncle. They murdered her uncle because he would not promise to vote Democratic. And just to show you how many, this is, again, we don't have the records yet of Lafayette because the newspaper doesn't survive, but this is neighboring Opelousas Parish, and this is just the white supremacist terrorist organizations that are listed on the front page where they're meeting right 1 week before the 1868 presidential election. The week after the election, all these disappear from the newspaper. Now, what are the results of the systematic terrorism against blacks? Here's the election results in 1868. Not one single black vote in all of Lafayette Parish, nor St. Landry, nor, in fact, in all these other parishes with large, either almost majority or majority black populations. There was systematic terrorism all throughout Louisiana. And there's lots of other parishes I could have put up that only had like 2 or 5 or 25 votes out of a large black population. So there was systematic terrorism across Louisiana, including Lafayette Parish, that basically guaranteed the white supremacist Democratic candidates were elected. After this, then, Congress, in response to this, passed legislation to try to enforce more civil rights. They passed all kinds of laws to try to prevent this. The problem, and they did send, President Grant sent U.S. colored troops to both Opelousas and to St. Martinville, not to Vermilionville. The problem is there were only a few, and imagine back then, you're only on horseback, there's no cars, the roads are poor. By the time you even get a message to St. Martinville or to Opelousas to come and help you, it's going to be days by the time anyone can arrive. There's not enough to police the whole area. There's very little they can do. And so there's just not enough of them to enforce this protection. And again, local whites would just not enforce this. Federal officials have been blocked by the U.S. Supreme Court, so there was almost no protection if you were black. Even though these laws were on the books, you had almost no protection from these laws. In fact, by 1874 then, these white supremacist organizations, these terrorist organizations, could just operate openly. They didn't even have to hide their identity anymore. So in 1874, you see advertisements for the White League, an extensive write-up, key notable figures are talking, endorsing the White League, and so they say, yeah, we're going to implement white supremacy by violence. And according to the records, about 500 members of Lafayette Parish, white men, joined the White League. That's about 25% of the adult white male population. But that's just the ones who actually joined. When you think of all of the jurors, prosecutors, judges, the whites who voted Democratic and were complicit in this and didn't stop, it meant that a majority of whites said, yeah, we are at least willing to go along with this. Even if we don't partake in it, we're at least willing to allow it to happen. And just a little example of the White League power in 1874. They took over the Opelousas Courier, and here's the vote in Lafayette Parish. The White League actually put its own candidates up against the Democratic Party, and where they said, the white Democrats said, but we're in favor of white supremacy too. We just don't think we should be quite as violent as you are. And the White League said, no, we need to be more violent, so we're going to run our own candidate. And here you see in the two races in Lafayette Parish, the White League candidate nearly lost one election, but won the other election in Lafayette Parish. So again, whites were very closely divided on not just the fact of white supremacy, but how white supremacy should be achieved. And what was their cause? They were very expressive about it. The local leader of the Lafayette Parish White League, Charles Homer Mouton, says, we claim as free men, meaning free white men, the privilege of electing none but white men for our representatives and public servants, and we cannot, without dishonor, consent to Negro political supremacy and to Negro social equality and to the transfer of government to the hands of the African race. So again, his self-expressed goal was to say no black can vote, no black can get elected, only whites should vote, only whites should be elected. And then the leader of the local Knights of the White Camellia, Alcibiade de Blanc, says that only the white race must and shall rule from the banks of the Rio Grande to those of the St. Lawrence. So again, they themselves, in their own words, said this is their cause. Another interesting thing I discovered from my research, the word bulldozing actually originated in this time. Now, if you're going to discipline a bull is a large animal, you're going to have to use real, harsh, brute force to discipline it. You have to give a dose of discipline fit for a bull. And originally this word was called bulldozing, and it was spelled with an S, and this is right around 1876 or 1874. And this term originated in Louisiana, meaning if you would commit this violence against blacks to stop them from voting, you would bulldoze blacks. You would be bulldozing the parish. Soon the S got converted to a Z because it was easier to pronounce. And by 1881 now, this, down at the bottom it says, Webster's Dictionary added the word bulldozing to the dictionary. And here they say, its origin is attributed to alleged, which was actual, alleged intimidation of Negro voters in Louisiana. So there actually became a term for this, that the Southern whites, especially Louisiana, said, we're going to just commit mass terror and violence and murder against blacks to make sure there's 100% white votes and white elected officials. We'll call it bulldozing. So Reconstruction ended. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but basically there was a disputed electoral vote count, and the Republican Party got the Southern Democrats to agree to allow the Republican candidate to become president, and in return the Republican Party agreed to end Reconstruction, to pull the Union troops out of the South, end Reconstruction, and allow the Southern whites to return to rule in the South. And so the North won the Civil War, but the Southern whites won Reconstruction by defeating it. But that didn't stop white terrorism. Throughout the 1880s and later, now it wasn't called the White League anymore. They were called the Regulators, or in this particular group of regulators, they called themselves the Lafayette Whites. And they say there, we want to maintain the supremacy of the white race. And now this is published in the Lafayette Advertiser. So they themselves are admitting, yes, that's what we're doing here. They shut down voting in Lafayette, murdered several blacks, including a 15-year-old girl. And what was interesting, though, I did find that despite this systematic terrorism, you had really courageous people who still ran and won office, and people who obviously then were voting. And I found 2 black officials there mentioned in the Lafayette Advertiser, Oscar Rhodes and Michael Foote. One was a constable, one was a justice of the peace. Yet they resigned under death threats from the regulators. And what's even more disturbing, even in 1906, you still have these regulators patrolling. So the regulators were patrolling town watching the Negroes. So these regulators, these armed groups of white supremacist terrorists, are still patrolling Lafayette Parish a half century after the Civil War. So really what you have is about 150 years of white supremacist terrorism, starting with the slave patrols, going through these other white supremacist groups, the regulators, and then sort of a somewhat of a resurgence of the KKK later. There you see that one there is the reference to the KKK is 1920, the Lafayette Advertiser. What's even sad is that it was such a part of the culture, the fact that just armed terrorists would ride around at night, that it just became part of the commercial culture. You see 2 commercials there in the Lafayette Advertiser on the right, one for pills, and they were also called night riders, these nighttime terrorists. And this advertiser says the worst night riders are basically these bad pills. They raid your bed to rob you of sleep. And so, but not so with these pills. Or fire, the night rider. So it was just, whites just treated this as, oh, well, of course, they're just night riders. We'll use them as part of advertising. So after you had the end of Reconstruction, Southern whites retook over, used the systematic terrorism to retake political power. Now, what was life like for blacks under this? Well, first, there was a system called sharecropping. And it began mostly with blacks, although by the 1900s it was poor whites who were part of this as well. If you didn't own land, and most blacks didn't, then you would rent farmland by paying a share of your crops each year. And so it was called sharecropping. But these shares were so large, and there were other penalties and fines imposed by the white landowners, that it basically kept the sharecroppers in perpetual poverty. And so, from generation to generation, you and your family would be stuck and trapped in this near system of slavery. What if you were able to acquire land or a business? There was a practice called white capping. Basically, these white terrorist organizations or groups would go around and threaten you to either give up your property or your land, or at least force you to sell it at a very cheap price. We have another one of those narratives from Lafayette Parish from a former slave, this one John Moore, and he says that, yeah, sometimes, so these terrorists would come around and tell you better sell and leave, sell your property and leave, and if you go see a lawyer, the lawyer would say, nope, you better sell, because the lawyer himself was part of this organization, the terrorist organization. You also had convict leasing. Now you might say, well, so if they're actually convicted of a crime, why not just have them work? But it was a rigged system. The term, the crime of vagrancy was defined at first as unemployment. And so if you were unemployed, you can be imprisoned for vagrancy, then basically leased out to a private worker. And because the owner of that business didn't care how hard they worked you, because if you did die, well, guess what? They would just rent another prisoner. And in fact, it wasn't until 1894 that because of such abuses, even in Louisiana, it was so abused that the whites said, boy, we can't have this kind of brutal murder going on. We'll actually outlaw it in 1894, and state workers can still work on state inmates can still work on public roads and levees, but we won't lease them out to corporations. But in 1906, Lafayette Parish did require convict leasing in an ordinance. They also required what's called peonage, or debt bondage. If you were convicted of a crime, even if you weren't imprisoned, let's say you had to pay a fine, but you couldn't afford to pay the fine. Well, then also you had to be, again, rented out to some private business owner until you could repay your fine. And here you see sections of the 1906 Lafayette Parish that both required the convict leasing if you were in prison and required peonage, what's called peonage, if you had to work off your fines. But again, the point was that it wasn't just for crimes. These crimes could be either trumped up, again, if you were a political activist, it was used as a tool of oppression oftentimes. You also had voting discrimination. That once Southern whites in Louisiana clearly retook power through terrorism, and they had essentially uniformly white Democrats in office, then they changed the Louisiana Constitution in 1898 to solidify voting discrimination. And from 1910 to 1944, according to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, there was never even 1% of black voter registration all throughout Louisiana because of all these discriminatory methods. And it wasn't really until 1965 that Congress passed the Voting Rights Act that really was ended. Now this voting discrimination then, now that you had 100% rule by whites, allowed them to implement a very widespread system of segregation, also known as Jim Crow. So segregation began in the 1880s, but it really didn't take off until 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson, when the Supreme Court basically upheld this concept of racially separating people under the concept of separate but equal. The theory was that the Equal Protection Clause doesn't say you have to be together, you can be separate as long as it's equal. But once the Supreme Court upheld segregation, then Louisiana and the other southern states, and including Lafayette Parish, ran with this concept. And here you see now all kinds of increasing segregation. By the way, in 1908, Louisiana allowed local governments to define or to add one of the definitions of criminal vagrancy as basically if you were a white and black person hanging out together. So if you have a friend, you're going to go to their home or business, you're now a criminal vagrant. And that was an option. So you might say, well, you know, a lot of these segregation laws were imposed by the state of Louisiana and Lafayette Parish. They really didn't want to follow them. And quite the opposite, Louisiana Parish added on additional segregation beyond what was required by the state. They decided they did want to outlaw criminal vagrancy as defined, as basically whites and blacks even mixing together at all as friends, even though they didn't have to do that. They then outlawed mixed-race pool rooms, billiard halls, taverns, and so they did way more than was necessary. Just some examples from the Lafayette Advertiser and the Opolis Courier, just local white attitudes saying that there shouldn't be any social equality between the races. But despite the severe oppression, if you couldn't look to whites for help and support, blacks looked within their own community. And here I was able to find this one article with sort of a gold mine, just this one little blurb. By the way, where I'm getting all these from, it's a great website. You can go to it free online. It's at the Library of Congress online site called Chronicling America. And it digitizes newspapers going all the way back into the early 1800s up through, I think, around 1924. And they're searchable by various search terms. So all these words are digitized. I've spent, my wife and I have spent a lot of sleepless nights all night just pouring through these archives, searching and reading issue after issue. And here you see a list of black benevolent societies. And this is probably only a partial list. This particular list was from 1903. But you see all these organizations where, again, blacks came together to support one another, given that you could not be a part of the white world. Well, Louisiana and Lafayette Parish kept continuing to further increase segregation. And one of the key points here is that it wasn't that over time, as the rest of the world was evolving, local whites said, oh, you know, we're starting to become more enlightened, that maybe the races should have more equality. Quite the opposite. Segregation was getting worse over time. More and more and more segregation laws were being added over time. Just a voter guide from 1960 that says, this is a public voter guide by the state of Louisiana that says segregation is an important matter for the legislature. Now, what if you tried to resist any of this? Well, you could be lynched. And there's a common misperception that lynching was specifically murdering someone by hanging them from a noose. And that did often happen. But often, the hanging someone by a noose was done after the person was already killed. Just like that earlier example I gave you of the suppression of the slave rebellion. They took the decapitated heads and put them on spikes along the river. What often happened was that the person was shot, stabbed, often burned alive, and then their murdered body was hung as a signal to other blacks: do not resist. Do not resist this kind of oppression. And what's even more disturbing is that, not in the Lafayette Advertiser, but its rival newspaper, the Lafayette Gazette, in the early 1900s, throughout the early 1900s, they repeatedly justified this practice. And here you see one example, just a little quote. They say, oh, what would solve this problem is for blacks to leave white women and girls alone. And so notice here, the threat of lynching terrorized blacks for a century after the Civil War, meaning if you dared to resist all this segregation and voting discrimination, you were literally putting your life in severe risk. And it wasn't just the laws that segregated. There was all kinds of unwritten segregation that really didn't need any law. Because if the universities didn't allow you to get if they were segregated, didn't allow you to get a law degree, for example, or a medical degree. Well, then if you have only white-only lawyers, that means you have only white-only prosecutors and judges. And if the if the jury lists are taken from the voter registration, well, if you can't vote, then that means, and only whites can vote, it means all the juries are all white. Local government and officials are all elected white. They're only going to hire white-owned businesses for government contracts, and so on and so forth. Even churches were segregated. And so there's all kinds of segregation that didn't require any law. It's just the practices of the whites in power that said you're not going to get a certain career, you're not going to get a certain education, you're not going to get employment, you're not going to get contracts. The point here is that there was far, far less economic opportunity for blacks under segregation than for whites. There was also housing segregation. This was done in a lot of ways. There could be zoning ordinances that would say where whites and blacks could be, restrictive covenants where whites would put in their property title deeds that this property can never be sold or leased to blacks. Banks would loan to blacks who were going to purchase in white neighborhoods. And this wasn't legally outlawed until 1968. In searching through, doing a few title searches at the Lafayette Parish Courthouse, I found a few examples of restrictive covenants here. Mouton Gardens, Jules Simon, Oaklawn Extension, and this was just after a few hours. I just wanted to find a few examples, which I did. I'm sure there are a lot more of them. In fact, here you see an official city map, or excerpts of city map from 1950, talking about schools, housing projects, parks that are segregated, indicated for white or colored. And now, this residential segregation still has lingering effects. Here you see, this is today, by the way, actually this is 2010 census data. We have the north side and the south side. The north side is predominantly black neighborhoods, the south side is predominantly white neighborhoods. And for years I suspected that there had been something intentional about this, and I could never really find the smoking gun, but I did in my research just a few weeks ago. In 1923, the Lafayette City Council passed a racial zoning ordinance that defined where whites and blacks could live and own businesses. And basically, what's very interesting is they passed it, and 1 week later they repealed it. Because it was actually, it came several years after the Supreme Court said this was unconstitutional. So there's one of two possibilities. Either they didn't know that it was unconstitutional, and someone pointed it out, and they repealed it a week later. Or they knew it was unconstitutional, but wanted to have an official declaration of where they expected all the whites to enforce this kind of segregation, and then repeal it so they could be immune from legal lawsuit. But everyone would now could simply look and say, okay, this is where we expect that to happen. And what were these neighborhoods? I've mapped out, because the ordinance actually defined it by street and then by corporate boundary. And so it's basically what we know as the LaPlace neighborhood, and today we call it Macomb-Visay, but it was really just Visay. And so these were the neighborhoods, but they left the outer northwest and southeast boundaries, and they said the corporate limits, meaning as the city expanded, those boundaries would be expanded. And you just see examples in some of the maps at the time indicating schools, businesses, and so on that are segregated. This could be worthy of the whole hour presentation itself, religious segregation. Not going to go into it in any more detail, but again, there's no law required here. Just churches themselves, these denominations said, yes, we're going to segregate. You also had social segregation. One interesting thing I discovered was that because Louisiana had basically outlawed any kind of events or festivals that were mixed race, if you were going to have Mardi Gras or a crawfish festival or any kind of thing like that, you'd have to have it separate white and black. In fact, here you have examples of the segregated Lafayette Mardi Gras, where it was not just separate Mardi Gras, but separate parade routes in the white and black neighborhoods. And an interesting thing here, there's a Lafayette Parish ordinance passed that prohibited you from completely concealing your identity by wearing gloves. Because if you had a mask and an outfit, but if you wore gloves, they could see what race you are. So they had to make sure you can completely conceal, but you can't wear the gloves. That's how concerned they were about keeping the races separate. Here you see examples of business segregation. Hospitals at the time had colored wards. And here's just a few examples of, again, there was no law required. You just simply wouldn't be hired. You wouldn't be hired as a police officer. You wouldn't be hired as a firefighter. You wouldn't be hired as a city bus driver. All these jobs are only open to whites. You also had school segregation. And that would also be worthy of a whole hour presentation itself. Just very briefly, there were a handful of schools for blacks during Reconstruction. The Freedmen's Bureau tried to operate one, a couple small ones. Finally, a public elementary school, a single one, was begun for blacks. And Paul Breaux is sort of a local hero. He's worthy of the statue for sure. He basically took over the elementary schools in 1898 and expanded the system and created several new black elementary schools. And when he died, then the person who became principal, W.D. Smith, created the first public black high school and named it Paul Breaux, after Paul Breaux. There was also a private high school for black girls, Holy Rosary Institute. The first public black school, actually, ironically, was in Alexander Mouton's former house. And then it burned down under suspicious circumstances. Depending on who you asked, it was either an accident or arson. There's just a photo. It's undated. It's obviously the late 1800s, early 1900s of Paul Breaux and students. But the key point here is that these separate but equal facilities were never separate but equal. They were separate and grossly unequal. Here, for example, are the school facilities. Large palatial concrete or cement, brick, white high school on the left, small wood house, high school on the right. Salaries as well. White salaries listed, this is from the Lafayette Advertiser at the time, this is 1907. White salaries on the top, black salaries at the bottom, half to 2/3 the salaries for teachers. And it really wasn't then until Brown versus Board of Education and enforcement of that you had Lafayette Parish school desegregation. Same thing with UL Lafayette desegregating, because it had been formed as specifically as a white university by the state statute when it was created. And again, just for time constraints, I wanted to skip through all that desegregation. But one key point I want to make is that it wasn't that as soon as the courts ordered desegregation, then it just happened. There was a lot of white local resistance, foot dragging, the school boards, the UL even. Technically, UL allowed black students into the classroom, but for a good another decade after technical integration, everything else on campus was segregated. The dorms, cafeteria, library, student activities, ROTC, athletics. It wasn't until a full decade later that all those began to be integrated. Now, who did all this apply to? All this discrimination and voting discrimination, segregation. Louisiana law defined it, and it was generally referred to as the one-drop rule, although the law basically said any traceable amount of Negro blood. So whether it was any amount that was visible in you, or if there was some record, your great-great-grandmother was black, that's it, you're defined as black, now you're subject to all this discrimination, all this segregation, and that's it. So basically only purebred whites in their mind were considered white. So when you look at this overall, the big picture, it was very different worlds. Whites and blacks were almost literally living in different worlds, where whites had unrestricted access to careers and wealth and just business opportunities, asserting your legal rights. All this was very highly restricted and dangerous even if you were black. Two different worlds. Also worthy of a whole other hour, the Lafayette Parish Civil Rights Movement, and this is probably the last avenue I still have to do in my research, because at the time the local media didn't want to cover these local events because they wanted to say, oh, we don't have this trouble here, it's happening elsewhere in the South, but it's not happening here. And from the people I've talked to that were alive at that time, they said, yeah, there wasn't much coverage in the local TV stations or newspapers. So I'm having to find this all out through basically oral history, talking to people, say, yeah, I was here, I experienced this, this is what happened. And so whether it was enforcement of voting rights or desegregating businesses, Lafayette Parish School desegregation, Lafayette desegregation. It's almost all oral history. It takes a long time to track down people, get them to agree to be interviewed, talk with them, and so that's still ongoing research right now. Now, you might say, well, gee, it was so bad for so long, who would want to stay around in this kind of situation? Why didn't blacks just leave? Well, a lot did. Right after Reconstruction, this was called the Exodus. It got so bad that the U.S. Senate actually decided we want to have an investigation. Why are so many blacks leaving the South? Now, the Democrats had taken power in the Senate, so their report said, oh, this is Republicans scheming to lure blacks into the North so they have more voters to win elections in the North. But the Senate Minority Report, which was the Senate Republicans, said no. It's a long series of persecutions, whippings, maimings, murders committed by Democrats, extending over a period of 50 years, has finally driven the Negro to despair and compelled him to seek peace and safety by flight. That the only way you can be safe was by leaving the South. Later during segregation, historians call it the Great Migration, where large numbers of blacks left the South. Here you see in about 1910, 90% of the black population of the United States still lived in the South. But they left to seek better economic and social opportunities elsewhere outside the South, in northern and western cities and states. So by 1970, it was only about half the black population of the U.S. was living in the South. Now, how does the Great Migration generally to the South compare to Louisiana and Lafayette Parish? Here you see percent of Louisiana population that is black went down steadily from 50% down to 30% over this time period. Notice it was even worse in Lafayette, significantly worse in Lafayette Parish. You see here on the left of the graph on the right, you see a big drop during Reconstruction. Because remember all that violence, that systematic terror and murder I mentioned earlier during Reconstruction. There was a significant drop in the black population during Reconstruction as blacks fled the parish. Then, during the Great Migration, the black population of Lafayette Parish then went from over 50% down to only around 20% by 1980. And it's only begun to rebound now as civil rights enforcement basically ended the Great Migration because now there would be equal, roughly equal political and economic opportunities in the South as well. But that just shows you that the situation in Lafayette Parish was worse than Louisiana as a whole or the South as a whole, given the Great Migration happened at a higher rate in Lafayette Parish than in other parishes. So where is all this history? Where has all this history been? Well, it was erased. It was rewritten by what's called the Lost Cause movement. After the Civil War, as I mentioned earlier, Southern whites, understandably, didn't want to say they caused 650,000 Americans to die fighting for a notion of white racial superiority and the enslavement of 4 million human beings based on the color of their skin. So they literally rewrote history. They erased all this, said the Civil War wasn't about slavery, Reconstruction violence didn't happen. If it did, it was because of the radical Republicans, and those darn Yankees destroyed this proud, noble way of life and the traditions of the plantations where slaves were happy and all this sort of stuff. And then they began to build monuments to glorify what they called the Lost Cause and its heroes. And you can watch a couple films, The Original Birth of a Nation in 1916, or Gone with the Wind in 1939, that sort of illustrate this notion of the Lost Cause movement. And Southern whites were so successful at rewriting Southern history that they got nationwide textbooks to adopt this view, and even just whites across the United States then began to have this view of, oh yes, this is what the Civil War was about, this was what Reconstruction was about. And it's only now in recent years, as historians are saying, no, that was the Southern whites rewriting and erasing history, that now this lost and erased and unwritten history is now being honestly and accurately told. So, and again, this is understandable human psychology. It's called cognitive dissonance, that human beings have trouble holding two different competing thoughts in their mind. And if you want, on one hand, you want to say, I'm proud of my ancestors, but on the other hand, my ancestors did really horrible things. That's hard to reconcile. So you could change belief one, say, well, gee, I'm kind of embarrassed or ashamed of some of the things my ancestors did. That's uncomfortable, might cause embarrassment, maybe family dishonor. So changing belief two is often easier. Oh, the Civil War wasn't about slavery, or my ancestors didn't fight for slavery, or my ancestors were good to their slaves. And violence against blacks didn't happen here. And any blacks who were murdered, they deserved it. They were troublemakers. And this is the one I hear most lately. You're just causing trouble. You're a race baiter. You're distracting from more important things. These issues don't matter. but they do matter, as I'll talk about in a moment. But there's an honest middle ground. Why not say, okay, my ancestors did some things I can be proud of, and my ancestors did some things that we should not be proud of, we should not celebrate, we should not glorify. In fact, they should be condemned. So this lost cause movement was very successful in New Orleans. They had the monument to white supremacy that was actually just taken down, as you know, maybe a week ago. Remember I mentioned the Colfax Massacre that basically ended the effort for any kind of enforcement of civil rights during Reconstruction. Well, in 1921, the whites of that parish erected a monument that says the 3 whites who died during the massacre were the heroes fighting for white supremacy. And that photo I took just a few weeks ago. And then in 1950, basically I think it was the Department of Tourism, Louisiana Department of Tourism erected that sign. So instead of calling it the massacre, they called it the riot, where they say 150 Negroes were slain. And they say, notice they say, this event marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. Now what do they mean by that? They called any Northerners who came down to enforce civil rights carpetbaggers, based on, they thought their suitcase looked like a bag of carpets. And the misrule that they were referring to, which again, they themselves said at the time, the leaders of the white supremacist terrorist organizations, said the misrule that they were objecting to was the fact that blacks could vote and get elected and have social and legal and political equality. This was the misrule. So you often see this narrative that was part of the lost cause movement, that there was just rampant corruption and horrible mismanagement by the Republican government in Louisiana, and that's what whites were rebelling against. Sure, there was some corruption. Sure, there was some fiscal mismanagement. There's been a lot of corruption and fiscal mismanagement by the whites of the Louisiana government for the last century. But that doesn't justify, but here's the point, but that doesn't justify murder, let alone systematic mass murder, because you think the government is corrupt. And the point here is that that's the only misrule that they were objecting to, was that blacks were getting equality. Now here again, I mentioned we have the lost cause movement in Lafayette. The Alfred Mouton statue was built in 1922, and at an early meeting, sort of the early planning stages for this, they talked about, the Sons of Confederate Veterans said, we need to keep alive the memory of the lost cause and its hero. But really, I don't want to focus on the statue because I think that's just one small point of a much larger problem. And I call it the lost cause mindset. That because the lost cause movement was so successful, so many whites actually don't think the Civil War was about slavery. They don't think there was much violence here. They don't think there's any problem. Here you see, for example, in the Opelousas Courier, 2 days after the passage of the Federal Civil Rights Act, in 1964, you had someone write a letter to the editor who say, we have lived here in Opelousas since the late 1600s without racial strife and with cordial relations both ways. And this is where the Opelousas Massacre occurred. And just last year at the Lafayette City Parish Council meeting about the Mouton statue, a white gentleman stood up and said, why are these people causing trouble here, wanting to, move the statue to a museum? We've never had a race problem in Lafayette. But here's the key point. We can't have racial unity without honesty. Honesty is the foundation of any relationship, your friendships, your family. You've got to have, if you can't trust the person, you can't unite, you can't move forward. So we've got to have honesty about this history. Just ask yourself, how many local books, memorials, monuments, museums tell the story of local Cajun Americans? Versus how many equivalent things tell the story of local African Americans? And if they do they do so to an equal degree as Cajuns? But here's another point I want to make. There is no white history or black history. You always hear February is Black History Month. There is no white history or black history, because this history is of people mixing together and interacting together. The history, if you're going to tell white history, you have to say, here's how whites interacted with blacks. If you're going to tell black history, you have to say, here's how blacks interacted with whites. You can't separate these out as if they exist in some different universe. These stories, these lives, these histories are completely interwoven. And you have to tell it, and if you don't tell that interwoven history, you're telling a very inaccurate and very incomplete version of history. And yes, we've had very different experiences locally, and we continue to have very different experiences locally, which is why this kind of dialogue and this kind of event is so critical. It's called conversation starters, because we've got to start talking about these things. We can't just keep pretending these things don't exist if we want to continue to move forward and to continue to improve our community. Here's one other little example I'll give you. On the left, I'm sure you've seen this flag, the Acadiana flag. It actually was declared the official flag of Acadiana by the legislature in the 1960s. And it officially represents French and Spanish heritage. Only French and Spanish heritage. The flag on the right, the Creole flag, designed in 1987, represents French, Spanish, and West African heritage. Now that's fine. People can fly whatever flag you want. I support that. But here's the point. How often have you seen the flag on the left used as if it is meant to represent all of the people, all of the culture, all of our region? So there's all kinds of untold heroes of Lafayette Parish. These are just some of them. You know, there's all kinds of opportunities to build monuments and memorials and museums and tell these inspiring stories of the people who endured under slavery, of the people who endured during Reconstruction, of people who fought back, U.S. colored troops who fought for their own freedom and their fellow people's freedoms, for Tunia Riard and other Reconstruction leaders who courageously ran for office and got elected in the face of, you know, very possible death and murder. All the people who survived and persevered and endured during segregation, Paul Breaux and other local leaders who improved life for blacks under Jim Crow, such as by improving the school system, the first black students at LPSS and UL, and their supporters, both black and white, who helped. And I know there are so many leaders. Some of you in here probably were a civil rights leader yourself locally, or you certainly know some people that should be on your list, but again, I'm relying on just the limited oral history I've been able to obtain so far. But people like Carlton James and Wilfred Pierre, and both black and white leaders. So again, why does this history matter? I want to just emphasize this again, sort of bookend this presentation on that. Because we still have the lingering consequences of all this history of racial oppression and segregation. We still have de facto, meaning it's not legally imposed anymore, but it is a matter of fact. It's still resulting. We still have de facto segregated neighborhoods. We have de facto segregated schools, de facto segregated churches, Mardi Gras crews. Most of our friendship circles still tend to be predominantly one race or the other. But there's also significant economic effects. For example, as I showed you earlier, under segregation, it was very difficult to have economic advancement if you were black. Most careers, most educational paths were forbidden to you, which meant you had trouble acquiring a home or a business. You had trouble accumulating wealth that you could then pass on to your children, your grandchildren, like whites could. So that left this increasing, growing disparity over time between whites and black wealth. And we still suffer that lack of intergenerational wealth, the disparities in wealth between whites and blacks. Another example. You know, you hear all the time, every year about, and recently in fact, how horrible our state's economy is, the tax revenues are down, the roads are poor, they're in poor condition, right? The schools are in poor condition. We might close state parks. Well, why isn't this happening to other states? Because in the Deep South, we had segregation. The Southern whites basically shot themselves in the foot. They severely held back the state's economy by saying, 1/2 of your population, we're not going to let you get advanced degrees. We're not going to let you make economic advancement. And we're going to forbid you from doing business with the other half of the state. That severely hindered the state's economy, which is why after the civil rights movement was successful, you still had the states of the Deep South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, that ended up being the worst in school performance, medical care, the economy, because they had so held themselves back economically. So we're still paying a price. Literally, the next time you hit a pothole that's gone a long time unrepaired, just say, well, thank you, Southern white leaders from the 1930s. All right. So I want to leave you, yes, on some hope and inspiration. Now you have a better knowledge of history, which allows you to have better empathy. If you're white, you can have better empathy for the experience that blacks have had locally and what they've gone through. And these oral histories do survive in the black community. And if you're black, understand that if whites aren't aware of this, it's not because they're racist, it's because literally they weren't told this in school. The lost cause movement was so successful. I have students come to me and they say, yeah, I never learned any of this. I was told by my teachers, or it was about slavery. So that's all they've been taught. So it's going to require time for this education to get out. But hopefully, this is going to give you motivation, because if you look how far we've come. Now, you know, if you look around this audience, it's about 50-50, I think, black and white, some other races too. This is great. What this group is could not have happened 150 years ago. It probably wouldn't have even happened 60 years ago. So we've made tremendous progress in this community. And that should give us inspiration that, yes, tremendous progress is achievable. Yes, we have a long way to go. But just think now 50, 100, 150 years ago, people could look back and go, wow, look how far we've come. But that means it's up to all of you to make this happen. And it can. Thank you. Questions, and you might have to holler. I can't even see most of you, so you'll have to holler if you have your hand raised.
I have a question. I just moved here about 7 or 8 months ago, and I just wanted, you had a slide up that talked about the consequences for people for slaves that ran away. This first one was maybe like cut off an ear, but you said it was branded by the Florida.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that's Florida Leaf.
Well, that translation, that particular English translation says the fleur-de-lis, but it was basically the fleur-de-lis. I was directly quoting. Yeah. That was under Louisiana before it became a state, but under the Louisiana French Code, the Black Code or the Code Noir.
So how do we continue to move forward from here?
Well, this is called Conversation Starters, which means the conversation must continue. And Ed Bowie from AOC has been very gracious. He's filming this. He's going to put it up on AOC. And he's going to splice in the slides into this presentation, as I said earlier. It really, you've heard the thing, you tell two friends, and they tell two friends, and they tell two friends. It really just is going to require a lot of people sharing this information, talking. I'm happy to give this presentation again to, let's say you're in a different community organization. But other people need to be doing this. I can't do this all myself, and I'm hopefully going to be turning this, I hope within the next year or so, maybe into a book. Ideally, I would love it if this information were used across all the Lafayette Parish school system. But but I think it really needs to just be distributed as widely as possible, and again, sharing. But creating these conversations to say, let's in our business, our community organizations, let's get together and say, let's talk about this. Look at the lingering effects we have in our community. How can we improve it? Knowing that these problems were caused over the long term. They were multi-generational problems, and they're going to require multi-generational solutions. But now that we have an accurate understanding, and I'm not saying that this was the entire cause of the issues we have today, but it was at least a significant cause. And so the only way you can come up with a complete solution is if you have this complete understanding. So just to, again, keep talking, get people together and keep talking. And then eventually, there's a term, a critical mass. If you get enough critical mass of people in the community to say, okay, it's time where we say, we're going to move forward with more racial unity and more racial justice and more racial equality, and we're going to come up with long-term solutions for these problems. And so there's no easy answer. It's going to take a lot of effort by a lot of people. But it's doable, again. Look at the history we've gone through. Look how we've come here today. It can be done, but it's going to take a lot of work. So I'm sorry I don't have an easy, quick fix answer, but it's doable.
I think part of it is you have to take your defenses down. You can't feel as though you're being attacked by the information. You have to be able to receive the information as it is, and not feel like racial baiting as we still use some of the same terms that you presented in your presentation.
Yeah. And
so the question is, how do you get somebody to relax, if you will, to hear the information as information and not as an attack on them or white people or black people personally?
Yeah, well, you let them know that I'm not attacking you. I don't hate you. I don't dislike you. In fact, I love you as a human being. I simply want you to understand this history so that we can be honest about this history, and then we can be honest about the causes of today. And so you approach it to say, yeah, I'm not attacking anyone. In fact, I'm trying to embrace you. I'm trying to say, let's tell all the history. No one wants to erase any history or rewrite any history. In fact, the opposite. We want to tell the history that has been erased. We simply want to tell the history that has been rewritten in a false way, and now we want to tell it honestly. And so we're trying to embrace one another. We're trying to have more unity. So now that's easier said than done, but you have to make that effort.
And saying that, it's just that what you were saying then exists still today. Because look how the people are protesting about the Newton statue, and they're standing with guns at the statues in New Orleans, daring people to tear them down, and because they don't want their history erased and all that kind of thing. And I never thought of it as a thing of erasing anybody's history, but telling the truth about history, as opposed to telling, as they used to coin the phrase, his story.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and it frustrates me every time I hear anyone say, oh, if we move a statue to a museum, that's erasing history. It's quite the opposite. No one that I've ever heard on TV or talked to wants to erase any history. It's saying this is part of the history, but it's been rewritten and it's erased the other half. We want to say, let's tell this history, but let's tell all the history, and let's tell it accurately. No one wants to, I'm a historian. I don't think any history should be erased. I think you've got to be brutally honest about all of history. And so it's frustrating because it's completely false. No one wants to erase any history. We simply say, let's tell all the history and tell it accurately. Like when you swear in court, you say, I want to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Well, we haven't had that historically. So let's tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That's all we're asking. Go. Lots of hands here. First hand I saw go up.
I think one of the sort of the pillars of the Lost Cause movement is the idea that the entire South was united. Have you seen any evidence in Louisiana of scalawags or anything like that?
Yeah, and by the term scalawag, that's what Southern whites used to refer to what they saw as traitorous Southern whites who joined with the Republicans in favor of black equality. Sure, because it wasn't uniform, and I hope I didn't give that impression. I mean, I'm generalizing because it was the majority, obviously, but there were always Southern whites that were Republican at the time, that were against secession. It was a small group in Lafayette Parish, but there were some that were against secession, that were in favor of black rights, that supported the Republican candidates, and were against the white terrorist organization. But unfortunately, they were just vastly outnumbered, which is why they weren't able to stop it. Same thing through segregation. There were supportive whites who were against segregation, but the problem was they were vastly outnumbered. They would have put an end to it had they had enough numbers. So I don't mean to say it's all whites by any means. No.
I didn't mean to imply it.
I've been struck by the fact that Lafayette High School is on the National Historic Register, and Paulbro High School, which is now Paulbro Middle School, is not. It seems to me that it might be a very positive thing to try to do things like get Paulbro School on the National Historic Register. That's a positive act as opposed to a confrontational act like trying to move the statue.
Well, get right on that. I saw a hand over here, yeah.
Now, we hear about the Ku Klux Klan and that terrorist organization, but you mentioned other terrorist organizations that were particularly in the Louisiana area, Lafayette Parish. Do you know if they're still active? Do you have any indication from your research?
I mean, if there are any, the White League is long gone, the Knights of the White Camellia, all those other ones during Reconstruction. There's no more regulators. If there are any KKK around, they're pretty much in the woodwork hiding. There's not very many that I'm aware of. I'm not saying there aren't. It's not something that probably the FBI or law enforcement could tell you if they are or not. Maybe the Southern Poverty Law Center would, but it's certainly not many, unfortunately. Oh, and yes.
First of all, I want to thank this organization for having this tonight. I want to thank you for coming and giving this information. The Bible says in Ecclesiastic, as your knowledge increases, so does your pain. I can tell you, I'm from St. Petersburg, Florida. I came here to play football. I'm in pain tonight. To not, now I want to make sure I say this right, because I know we're going to be on television, but I want to make sure I say this right. Because, you sit here and we hear the horrid history of what's going on in the United States, and then we come and see the horrid history of what's going on right here in Lafayette. And I remember leaving from St. Pete, and my uncle who raised me said, why are you going there to Louisiana? I knew nothing about all of this. I knew nothing about all of this, but I have continually heard since I have made Lafayette my home at this point. I go home every Christmas, but I got kids here now. I have a vested interest here now. I practice law here now. I've been into politics. I ran for city parish president here. I look at this and I look at the politics and I ask myself, what the hell was I thinking? Running for city parish president here. But you know, what really scares me is that some of the same things that you're showing, and we ask the question, we have a long way to go. But when I look in the courtrooms, Louisiana has the highest incarceration of black men in the world. And when I'm looking right here, and you telling me we have a long way to go, I got kids that are in college, I got kids that are 26. Can we really promote a place like this to raise our kids? When society across the country, it's not black and white, our kids are interracially marrying. We're in a technological age. It seems that the generations are gonna be beige. I don't know what to do. Can we continually have this racial divide? We recognize that Kathleen Blanco did not win Lafayette Parish, David Duke won it. So are we still talking about something of the past? Or has racism disguised itself? We got two black judges we got two black judges. We got sides of the town that, bottom line, you're not gonna win. So where are we at this stage in 2017? Are we intellectually disguising racism? Is this place a place where we can honestly and truly raise our children? Or do we have to be still afraid? Do I have to be afraid that what I say on this television won't come back and have repercussions on me? But it ain't about me right now, it's about my children. And it's about everybody else's children here. So I thank everybody for coming here because I think this is a starting ground for everybody. And thank you.
Thank you. That's exactly the conversation that needs to happen, is because, remember I said earlier, whites and blacks have lived and are still living in two different worlds. And your story, whites need to hear your story, because that's how we're going to unite, is to say, okay, tell me your story. Let me listen. Let me listen with an open heart and mind. Tell me your perspective. Tell me your experience. And that's how we get to know each other, and that's how we can work together. So thank you for sharing your story. Yeah.
For the first time in 52 years, I received an invitation to my high school reunion. I was the first of, myself and 4 other blacks that integrated Mount Carmel Academy. We were never invited to anything. Recently, someone stopped by Northside, where I work, to see me, to invite me to the 50th class reunion. 52 years. No proms, no ring ceremonies, no dances, no gatherings, social gatherings, nothing. I will be having a reunion in September with Holy Rosary, because that's where I was taken from. And you would think that a Catholic school, it wasn't only the students, it was the teachers, the parents, everybody associated with Mount Carmel Academy. If it were not for Father Oliver at Holy Rosary, I would not have attended Xavier University, because Mount Carmel's principal declared me ineligible to go to college. But I went, I succeeded, and I don't care about repercussions. I'd rather die than lose my freedom. And that's what I passed on to my children, my grandchildren, and I will be passing it on to my great-grandchildren.
I have a question. I was raised and born here, and I came here tonight for some answers. I'm 54, and I feel there's that this just kind of reaffirms some things for me. My question for you is, when something is ingrained, there are a lot of people that say or feel they're not racist, okay? But they are. They just don't say the word. The attitude, I see it all the time, and it hurts me because I was raised in a very racist home. And probably in my late 20s, early 30s is when I started discovering, you know, and to shed all that, it is very hard. So my question to you is, as a white person, how do we confront those issues and make the point what you taught us tonight, the true history? Because when people can't even understand that they still have some element of racism in them, because it's generational. I mean, you know, and I'm not making an excuse. I'm saying that, how do you start to break that?
You got to get to know people. And I'll give you an example. When I first moved here in 2001, I would give public presentations, and I was in some public debates in favor of same-sex marriage. And that was some pretty hostile audiences back in 2001. And really, of all the different groups that have been persecuted throughout U.S. history, it's remarkable the rapid change in acceptance of gays and lesbians, right? From large majorities being opposed to equal rights to now significant majorities in favor of equality. And some social scientists have said the reason for that is because, you know, we can see what your race is, but we can't see what your sexual orientation is. And so many people kept it hidden. And there was a tipping point when all of a sudden people say, you know what, I'm going to come out. When everyone came out, then suddenly everyone realized, oh, my sister, my brother, my child, my best friend, right? They're gay or lesbian. And so suddenly people realized, oh, you're a human being too. You're just as human being as I am. And so it was by getting to know them, all of a sudden it was a rapid shift of saying, okay, yeah, we're all just human beings. We all should love one another equally. And so I think it really is just getting to know one another. You know, if you're in, let's say, a community organization and it's all white, well then sit down and say, why are we all white? And the same thing, if you're in a community organization, you're all black. Say, well, why are we all black? What can we do to reach out and recruit members and get people to say, hey, let's have a diverse group of people because we're all human beings and we shouldn't be divided just based on the color of our skin. And you know, the notion of race is really what social scientists call a social construct. I mean, you know, there's no biological basis for race. It's just that human beings have picked on one particularly noticeable physical difference and labeled it as race. You know, but why not hair color, eye color, height, or weight, you know, or whatever. But it's just we said, well, we're going to label skin color as race. But there's actually no biological basis for it. And so if you simply meet someone who has a different skin color and you get to know them and you become friends and you realize, oh, you know, it breaks down those stereotypes. It breaks down those negative stereotypes you have, and you realize, oh, guess what? We have, you know, we're way more alike than different. We have the same interests, or we just basically want to be happy in life, and we want to get married, have kids, or you know, we want to be successful, and we have the same struggles in life, the joys and sorrows. And guess what? We're all really the same, and we're essentially human beings. And so you got to get to know people. So, and yeah, that takes effort. That takes effort. I mean, I have to make that effort. My wife has to make that effort, right? At UL, we have to make that effort. So, yeah, you got to make that effort. But that's how you do. You reach out, you bring people in your friendships, in your organization, you get to know them, and then it breaks down those stereotypes. And it's not easy. It takes a long time, but that's what you got to do. Yeah.
Yes, it's not really a question. It's really a comment. Kind of piggyback off of what you said and slightly answer you a little bit back here. I kind of hear this like this trend that the onus is on black people to be more friendly to white people. Like, well, I'm not like those other black people. I'm a Like, it shouldn't be that. It's like, you can't expect black people to be the helping hand when our hand was the one being crushed. You know what I'm saying? So it's really having to speak to other people in your social circle, like, y'all know what? This is kind of jacked up that you lock your doors and you see a black kid walking down the street, but you don't say anything about this, white kid who might be the next, mass murderer at the high school, local high school. You know what I'm saying? It's like, like having to hold your own friends, your own circle accountable, and like confront it. Like when you have that, your cousin that's saying something like mad racist, or even kind of a little bit microaggressive racist, that's kind of wrong, and this is why. And I love you, and I'm not attacking you, but this is what's wrong. Like the onus can't be on black people to be nice and like let's be friends, everyone, because black people have, just didn't want to live and exist in this anyway. It's other people, the social construct, and individuals who are using their actions and behaviors to hold the racial differences here. Because it's not like black people have power to say, well, you know what, we're just not going to do it for white people. It's been the other way around. So it's going to be white people and people who are white adjacent to be like, you know what, this is wrong. I'm going to call you out when you're doing these wrong things. It has to be in your own social circle. Because if we do it, you're just cool. Right? You just want to have an excuse and nothing. Like, well, if somebody who looks like you was already telling you this, kind of like how you said, like people in the LGBT community, like, oh, this is somebody who's already like me. And so then you realize that, oh, I can respect the humanity because they are like me. It's like you have to pull that same type of thing. Like you have to confront your own social circle and say, that's not this is not something I'm going to tolerate. And raise your kids to say, this is not something I'm going to tolerate. And not in no tokenism, oh, this is my black friend. And not in no type of way like, well, I don't see color. Because no, there is color. Because we have different types of cultures and social experiences. And you have to respect that. You know what I'm saying? You can't just be like, well, I'm gonna just act like racism is a thing. Like, no, let's talk about race and why race is here and why racism exists. Like, it can't just be, oh, let's be bloody proud. Even though I feel like unity is a great goal to have, the onus can't be on black people to be friendly and make white friends. I'm not gonna do so.
That's right. We have to stop giving people a free pass. A free pass at work because it makes us uncomfortable. A free pass at Thanksgiving because it makes us uncomfortable, right? No more family free passes. No more Facebook free passes, right?
Well, you're using the race card, or you're a troublemaker, or you're a racist. That's how you're labeled.
And it's consistent. It's every time your uncle says the N-word, every time your coworker tells a racist joke. It's not funny. No more free passes.
Absolutely.
Really quick. Have you ever been discouraged professionally or personally from spreading this message?
This particular message I only started, a few months ago. I have been. It's interesting. I've had white people tell me, "Be careful! Don't do this. You're gonna." You're rocking the boat. You're, be careful what you say. Say it very delicately because white people are going to get upset and angry. And so, in fact, I've had some. I don't want to say arguments, but some disagreements with some people that say, "No, I want to say X," and they're like, "No, don't say X. Say it like Y." And I will say I've barely toned down a couple things just with the language I'm using more really. But yeah, I've been, people have been hesitant. And in fact, I've had people say they wouldn't do it, white people tell me they wouldn't do it because they just don't want to, again, they don't want to rock the boat.
Thank you for your courage.
Yeah. I appreciate that, but I mean, it is 2017, so, I admit when I was telling my wife this, as I'm reading through, like the Reconstruction violence and even violence going into the early 1900s, I get depressed because I'm thinking, wow, I don't know that I would have the courage to be doing this if it was then, knowing that I have a 50-50 chance of walking outside getting murdered. So, I'm not going to claim that I have this courage. I don't know. But thank you. I see a hand, I think, way back there. Yeah.
I just want to piggyback on what you said earlier. I heard about this on Saturday from a friend who had actually heard you give this presentation before. And he spoke about how great it was. And there have been some, I work in a very conservative office, and so it's not hard to
seems theoretically easy to speak up when someone says something, but you know, for all of us, the reality of saying to your boss when they say something offensive, don't say that. When you have family to feed, it doesn't really work.
It's not a take the car.
It's really hard. But that's not what this comments about. I just wanted to say that, you know, in my office today, I mentioned that I was coming to this talk, and a coworker said, well, is it about the statutes? And I said, you know, I don't think it is, but then I put it up the Facebook page and I kind of mentioned what it was about, and she kind of touched on the statute and said, well, you know, I disagree with removing them and blah, 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 and I'm not going to go back, but I said, you know, the purpose of me going is I just want to know. I just want to know more because I really don't. And honestly, after the whole election stuff, I just kind of closed myself off to all media and news reports. I just couldn't take all the madness. So I really have no idea what's been going on. But anyway, I just wanted to know more. And I had no idea. And not to be all crazy and emotional, but really, I had no idea. And what you said was so prophetic in that, as an apology, really, to black people that I had no idea, and to white people, like, we should, not that we should be standing up and saying, I'm so sorry, I mean, we didn't have a hand in what was happening, but I can't help but feel bad that, one, that we didn't know this, not our fault, because it was obviously being told in a way that wasn't true, but I wonder sometimes in my interactions, should I do more or say more to bridge the gap sometimes?
You can always say this is unprofessional at the very least. You can at the very least say this is unprofessional and inappropriate, and that's fair.
Well,
that's very fair.
That was an aside. What I'm saying, I went off. To touch on what she was saying, you know, the onus shouldn't be on her, but you know, what do we do to bridge the gap? Like, I'm thanking him for saying, you know, we didn't know. I'm sorry that I don't know the words. But also, like, I didn't know, and I still feel like sometimes I should do more to connect. Because I feel like, you know, maybe sometimes like I'm an outsider or I'm not doing enough to bridge the divide or connect more, and I want to, you know,
We'll hear about it. We'll do something.
and we have a conversation, you know, but especially after seeing some things and hearing some things, even locally, that there was so much we didn't know, and now knowing about this whole thing with the statute, now I know more. Like, you can't not know that once you know it. But I don't know, you know, if there's conversation, now the conversation has started. Like, is there more you should do? I don't know. I guess.
Yes. I think there's always more. Yeah. Thank you. I see a hand. Richard, I think. Yeah.
I stepped behind that lived in Lafayette since 1956. And at that time, our president, Secretary Paul, was the old Tears building. And the water fountains were segregated in the sign building. And the bathrooms were segregated in the sign building. And a group of us who quickly over here went down to try to integrate a part of the UL students well. US out then. We're there. We're literally trying to integrate this group. And from the Catholic Student Center. And the whole UL football team was standing out in front to keep us from going in. And he included the son of the again trying university president with whom I had gone to school in the segregated school. So I would make the point that Lafayette has come a long way. I'm not disagreeing with absolutely anything, but those of us who do know and who have lived through the earlier time of very blatant segregation, now I'm more concerned about the fact that we haven't redistricted our schools. And we have schools that are 95% and what happened to NB Moss in the community, and whether neighborhood schools are, how do we handle neighborhood schools if they are essentially segregated in the same way they were. The school board hasn't touched redistricting other than a slight rezoning thing. And that
Facebook, and I would always say, I think the majority of racist comments or racist attitude from blacks are reactive, and when it's from whites, many whites, it's proactive. There have been times when I've gone to a house and it was someone prominent and they own a business, and all the decor in the kitchen was samples and maids and stuff, and all their employees, they own the business, were black. But when I walked in the kitchen to search the kitchen, because believe it or not, I was searching that house for narcotics, all the decor were maids and a soap dish with a guy with big black lips, big red lips. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, that's how she sees blacks as just servants. And not only does she see that, but she has that on display. So now, what is her kid? Because she had a teenage kid. Maybe that's why he was on the. But I mean, how's her kid going to see his classmates when they go to school? You know what I'm saying? And then, of course, me myself, I experienced, and I can remember one time I was working undercover downtown, and it was me and two of my white partners, and we went to a bar, and I had on a V-neck shirt, some Timberlands, and some blue jeans, and they had on blue jeans, tennis shoes, and they had baseball caps, and they were backwards. And we go to this particular bar, and we work, we undercover, and they both walk in, and the guy puts a band on their arm. And I walk in like maybe 10 seconds after them, and the guy literally does this to me at the door. He does. You can't come in. And I'm like, why? He does. You have a red shirt on. And I look in the window of the club, and everybody has on red shirt. And I turn to him and I say, isn't UL colors red? And he would not let me in the club, And at that point, I started seeing, because I started experiencing, I would go to certain places out of uniform and I would just get shunned or whatever. And then one day I might go in uniform and I would just be, how you doing? How you doing? You need help? And I started telling my coworkers, you treat me like that or they treat me like that because I'm blue. Because I'm blue, they treat me like that. Because when I'm black, when I don't have this badge on, when I'm just in t-shirt and jeans, they don't treat me like that. They don't talk to me like that. And to end what I'm talking about, my son, he played high school football. He went to Catholic school, predominantly white, and he was a quarterback, first quarterback at that particular school. And he broke Jake DeLong's records. So now he goes to school. But, I'm teaching my son at the same time, your dad is a police officer, so you need to respect, respect policemen and respect people in general, but at the same time, be on your P's and Q's and don't do this when they stop you. And don't look this way. Don't answer them this way when they stop you. And he said, Dad, everyone at the school treat me a certain way, but I know it's only because I'm winning. And I said, I'm glad you know that, but I said, when it comes to policemen, you still need to be on your P's and Q's. And one day, I'm glad this happened. I'm sad it happened, but I'm glad it happened. One day we were going to visit Ole Miss, and we were driving through Pearl, Mississippi. And I just got on that particular highway, and I was in the right lane. I was in the slow lane, and I was driving a Avalanche. At the time, I wasn't in a Bentley or nothing. I was in an Avalanche. And I passed up a unit. It was a Charger. It had the ghost decals. I don't know, the ghost decals are kind of like what the marshals have, where you have to look at it a certain way to see the words written on it. And I complimented the vehicle as I passed it. I told my son, I said, that's a bad unit, because that's what cops do. We bad units. And continued driving. I looked in my rear view and I said, he gonna get somebody. Because he was in the left lane flying, right? So I'm looking at him in my mirror and I'm still driving. I'm looking at my son and he's looking back. And all of a sudden the unit gets on the side of me and it coasts on the side of me. And my son said, what is he doing? And I said, he profiled. Now my son knew what profiling meant. He just had never experienced it because he was a 12th grader. He hadn't experienced it. And then once he saw that I was driving and that I had another black male in my passenger seat, he got behind me and he pulled me over. Now I'm a policeman of 17 years at that point. And he walks up to the passenger side and he says, can I have your registration, license, and insurance? And I said, sure. I said, what'd you pull me over for? And he said, you didn't signal your lane change. And I said, but I'm in the same lane I was in when I passed up your unit. I complimented your unit down the street when you were parking in the grass. And his exact response was, well, you swerved. And when he said that, I said, you're a highway interdiction officer, aren't you? And he said, yeah, how you know? I said, because I'm what you are in Louisiana. I said, I've been doing it for 17 so years. So he said, can I have your commission card? So I said, yeah. So I pulled it out and I gave him my commission card, my driver's license, my registration. And I told him I needed to be in Ole Miss at a particular time because I had to register my son. He walked to his unit, 2 more units pulled up, including the K9. Then all of a sudden, after 15 minutes, my cell phone rang and I answered it. And it was my dispatchers calling from Lafayette. And they said, are you all right? And I'm like, what you talking about? Well, the cops called to verify that you were really a police officer in Michigan. And I said, yeah, I'm fine. Eventually, he walks back to the car and he gives me my information. And he tells me he wants a small talk, and I'm not in the mood for small talk. I don't want to leave it that way. And I called him back to my car before he turns away. I told him, about 9 months ago, he took a class in Pearl, Mississippi, in the same city we're in. I said, the name of the class was Highway Interdiction. I said, the first class of the whole session was called Why Not to Profile. And I said, it was taught by a person from LAPD, a Hispanic guy from Los Angeles. And he looked at me and he said, how do you know all that? And I said, I sat on the side of you for a week. And then I turned to my son and I said, this is the real world. Yeah. And this is what I'm trying to prepare you for. Because if it was only you, the next question would have been, do you have any narcotics in your vehicle? No, sir, I don't have any narcotics. Do you mind if I search? Well, no. Why would you want to search what I did to make you think I have narcotics? Sir, just answer the question. Do you mind if I search or not? Well, no, I don't want you to search. It's my dad's truck. Then you park on the side of the road. K9 comes. They alert or not alert. You know what I'm saying? And the whole stop was fabricated because, first of all, I didn't switch lanes. And when I told you I didn't switch lanes, then you said, well, you swerved. So it's kind of a no-win situation. And the only reason I won that situation was because I had a badge. And believe it or not, as a policeman of over 20-some years, I've been stopped numerous of times. Numerous of times. The worst thing I ever did was buy H2 when they first came out. Numerous of times as a police officer. And that in itself dampened, it kind of, that spark I had to serve the community, and I saw that I wasn't seen on that same level as everyone else, and I saw that even you as a policeman, just you being a black male, you still can be a victim of what everybody is complaining about in this country right now.
The preceding program was made possible in part with production assistance provided by AOC Community Media.